Hey guys, tonight we sit
Subscribe to
quietly
my
into the
channel.
humid midnight air of ancient Alexandria. A warm breeze rustles the palms as you glide past limestone columns and the flickering torches that line the royal courtyard. The Nile glows under a half moon, a quiet mirror for a city that never truly sleeps. Inside the palace, soft linen curtains billow as we pass through open archways, and you catch a whiff of frankincense mingling with honeyed wine. You're not here to meet a pharaoh in gold armor or a cartoon vixen with dramatic eyeliner. No, this queen is something else entirely. Cleopatra, the woman history either glamorized to absurdity or vilified beyond recognition, waits just beyond the next marble arch. And tonight, you're going to see her like never before. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who else is drifting off across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly through the halls, your sandals whispering against polished floors, and you wonder how did this young queen, barely in her 20s, end up holding one of the greatest empires of the ancient world in the palm of her perfumed hand. When Cleopatra ascended the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt was already a few centuries past its golden age. The Great Pyramids were ancient even to her. The temples of Karnak and Luxor stood like time-traveling ghosts from a distant past. Alexandria, her capital, pulsed with Greek learning, Egyptian rituals, and foreign traders bartering everything from cinnamon bark to peacock feathers. And smack in the middle of it all was Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, Greece's most eccentric family, gifted the land of the pharaohs like a consolation prize after Alexander the Great's empire cracked apart. You picture her now, not reclining on a chaise in a Hollywood set, but seated upright on a basalt throne, draped in white linen, gold jewelry catching the lantern light, a diadem resting against her tightly braided hair. She speaks softly to an advisor, in fluent Egyptian, even though her court mostly uses Greek. That in itself is odd. None of her ancestors had bothered to learn the native language. Most people think Cleopatra ruled Egypt by batting her eyelashes at powerful men. You'll soon see it's more accurate to say she weaponized every tool available to her: language, religion, culture, diplomacy, and yes, sometimes even eyeliner. And what a setting she had. The palace grounds stretch nearly a mile along the harbor. Lotus gardens spill over marble walkways, giraffes graze behind silk screens, royal scribes with ink-stained fingers sit cross-legged beneath shady tamarisk trees, scribbling decrees. In one corner of the palace, alchemists fiddle with powders and unguents. In another, dancers rehearse in silence, barefoot in the moonlight. It's a world between worlds, Greek in bloodline, Egyptian in soul, and just cosmopolitan enough to make you dizzy. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra was raised like a Greek philosopher's daughter or an Egyptian goddess in training, likely both. She studied rhetoric, astronomy and medicine, and was probably reciting Homer before you figured out your multiplication tables. But she also knew the rituals of Isis, the sacred geometry of pyramids, and how to ride a horse like a Scythian warrior. Oh, and she didn't look like Liz Taylor. Coins minted during her reign show a woman with a strong nose, prominent chin and sharp eyes that likely missed nothing. She wasn't trying to win beauty contests. She was branding herself. That nose. It's become the stuff of legends. Pascal once mused that if Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, the whole face of the world would have changed. It's a poetic exaggeration, but there's a sliver of truth to it. Every decision she made, every alliance she forged, every image she crafted, it all played a role in the fate of not just Egypt but Rome, Judea, Parthia, and beyond. Tonight though, you don't have to worry about geopolitics, just lean into the moment. Imagine the warm scent of lotus oil drifting on the breeze. A servant offers you wine chilled in snow carried from Mount Lebanon. In the distance, musicians pluck softly at lyres while an old tutor explains planetary orbits using a gold-painted armillary sphere. Cleopatra walks past you, her gaze flicking over scrolls, treaties, and you, as if she's sizing up the whole world in a single glance. And if you think she's already impressive, just wait until we unravel the rest of this story. Word count 1074. You're still lingering in that dusky corridor of Cleopatra's palace, the tiles cool under your feet, when something quietly odd sinks in. For all the ankhs, pyramids, and papyrus scrolls surrounding her, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, wasn't actually Egyptian. Her family, the Ptolemies, were Macedonian Greeks, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, After Alexander died without an heir, naturally, his generals carved up the empire like kids dividing a giant cake with no knives. Ptolemy got Egypt. And rather than blending in or marrying into the local nobility, the Ptolemies did something spectacularly tone-deaf. They stayed Greek for centuries. Now imagine this. You walk through the streets of Alexandria and hear Greek philosophy debated in cafes, see Greek drama performed in outdoor theaters, and find temple graffiti not in hieroglyphs, but in Greek. Cleopatra's ancestors didn't even bother to learn the native Egyptian language. They ruled from above, like a foreign bubble floating over the land. But Cleopatra? She breaks the mold. Historians believe she was the first of her line to actually speak Egyptian fluently. It's like if a British royal suddenly started giving speeches in perfect Welsh, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. That alone made her unique. By speaking to her people in their own language, she earned a loyalty her predecessors never could, and it didn't stop there. She studied the sacred rituals of Isis, adopted Egyptian religious iconography, and even styled herself in official portraits as a pharaoh, complete with that awkwardly regal kilt, double crown and cobra headdress. You can practically hear the Greek elite rolling their eyes. Was it political strategy? Definitely. But was it also personal? That's harder to say. Historians still debate whether Cleopatra genuinely embraced Egyptian identity, or simply wore it like a well-fitted costume, but to the common people, it likely didn't matter. Here was a ruler who didn't just sit behind scroll-covered desks muttering in Greek. She prayed at their temples. She walked barefoot during sacred festivals. She invoked ancient gods whose names hadn't been spoken in royal chambers for generations. Now step with me into a side room of the palace, a sort of cultural mash-up den. On one side busts of Homer and Plato, on the other statues of Bastet and Osiris. Incense from Nubia curls around amphorae of olive oil and baskets of dates. Cleopatra didn't choose one world over the other. She blended them, fluid and unapologetic, like a queen who could quote Sophocles in the morning and lead a ritual to Hathor at sunset. And if you're picturing a rigid queen obsessed with image control, well yes, but also no. She played the long game. One obscure detail often overlooked is that she traced her lineage not just to Alexander's army, but all the way back to Dionysus, god of wine and chaos. It's unclear whether she truly believed it, or just liked the drama of the claim. Either way, it gave her another divine credential to add to the mix. You know, just in case Isis wasn't enough. Picture this: Cleopatra in a temple courtyard, swathed in gold-threaded linen, arms raised beneath a star-cluttered sky, invoking both Isis and Dionysus as her spiritual ancestors. The local priesthood nods with cautious reverence. Greek advisors shift awkwardly in their sandals, and somewhere, a Roman spy takes notes with rising confusion. What you're seeing is not just multiculturalism, it's survival. Egypt at this point was a prize everyone wanted. Rome, the rising juggernaut, had its beady little eyes on it. Cleopatra knew that staying purely Greek would alienate her subjects. Going full Egyptian risked losing favor with foreign allies. So she did what great politicians do best. She shape-shifted, and oh how she shifted. In one surviving inscription, she's called Philopator, lover of her father. In another she's Thea Neotera, the new goddess. She's everywhere and nowhere, traditional yet rebellious. Old world royalty wrapped in cutting-edge PR. Let's take a slower breath here. You sit near a gently burbling fountain in the palace garden, where pink hibiscus blooms release their perfume under moonlight. In the quiet, you start to realize just how much Cleopatra's identity was a performance, not of deception, but of deliberate design. Every accent she used, every outfit she chose, every god she invoked, it was all part of a masterclass in ruling by story. And the story she told was this: I am Egypt, I am Greece, I am divine, I am survival wrapped in silk. You lean back, listening to distant laughter and the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and you start to think, maybe that's Cleopatra's real magic. Not just her beauty, not just her intellect, but her ability to walk between worlds with bare feet and braided hair, and somehow belong to all of them, or at least convince everyone she did. You wake, figuratively, to the sound of soft sandals on mosaic. Cleopatra's shadow glides across the courtyard. Silent, poised, and maybe a little smug. You're still wondering what made her so magnetic. Was it charm? Strategy? That suspiciously famous eyeliner? But let's talk about the nose. Because yes, that thing has earned almost as much historical commentary as the pyramids. The Roman philosopher Pascal famously wrote, that if Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, the whole face of the world would have changed. A dramatic statement, but also kind of hilarious when you imagine world history balanced precariously on a single facial feature. Now, let's clear something up. She wasn't necessarily beautiful by modern standards. Coins minted in her lifetime show a woman with a prominent hooked nose, thin lips, and sharp features. Not the dreamy seductress painted by Renaissance artists or Elizabeth Taylor's movie star version. She was striking, yes, but not in the way history textbooks like to pretend. Here's the deal. Cleopatra's power wasn't her face, it was her presence. She had what modern casting directors would call commanding screen energy. Ancient writers like Plutarch, who lived about a century after her death, so take his gossip with a pinch of salt, insisted that it wasn't her looks that bewitched people, it was her wit, her conversation, her charisma, and her voice, described as like music. You can imagine her now at a Roman banquet, reclining amid velvet cushions, casually quoting Homer between bites of honeyed figs, while some poor senator fumbles with his wine goblet just trying to keep up. Her confidence didn't shout, it purred, but behind that social finesse was a razor-sharp intellect. She spoke at least 9 languages, possibly more. She could debate philosophy, interpret dreams, calculate star charts, and negotiate grain exports before breakfast. Historians still argue whether her education rivaled that of the greatest scholars of her time, but even her enemies admitted, this woman was terrifyingly competent. Let's picture this. You're sitting in on a diplomatic meeting between Cleopatra and a delegation from the Nabatean kingdom. Most rulers would have scribes whisper translations into their ears. Not Cleopatra. She welcomes them in perfect Aramaic, references a local flood myth, and brings out a dish that mirrors their homeland cuisine: roasted lamb with spiced dates and pistachios. Subtle? No. Effective? Hugely. And speaking of subtlety, Cleopatra didn't always do it. In portraits and statues, she presented herself as the goddess Isis, not like Isis, as Isis, the divine mother, protector of the throne, and resurrector of dead husbands. You know, light stuff. It was a bold PR move, one that blurred the line between human queen and living deity, and in the context of ancient Egypt, where gods were very much woven into daily life, this wasn't just theatrics, it was spiritual propaganda. Still, even the goddess routine couldn't fully protect her from how Rome saw her. The Romans were famously uncomfortable with powerful foreign women. They painted Cleopatra as a temptress, a sorceress, a manipulator, with a venomous tongue, and a wardrobe full of witchcraft. To them, she was danger in silk form. But here's what's interesting. Despite all the pearl clutching, they were obsessed with her. Plays were written about her. Poems gossiped about her affairs. Political speeches railed against her. Even years after her death, she lived rent-free in Rome's head for centuries. You sip from a cup of rosewater as Cleopatra walks past, her gold cuffs clicking softly. She's smiling, but her mind's already 10 steps ahead. She knows Rome underestimates her. She knows they're afraid of her, and she's absolutely planning to use that fear like a blade tucked into her dress. It's easy to forget, lying here under the stars of long-dead Alexandria, just how dangerous charm can be. Cleopatra didn't win because of her beauty. She won because she understood what beauty meant to other people, and she turned that understanding into power. Now close your eyes for a second. Imagine drifting down the Nile on Cleopatra's royal barge, its sails perfumed, its deck lit with 1,000 tiny lamps. Musicians play gentle melodies on flutes and harps. She sits near you, calm and radiant, discussing mathematics 1 minute and military logistics the next. She laughs at your jokes. She catches your meaning before you even finish the sentence. And just like that, you understand what so many men, generals, philosophers, emperors, never could resist. Not a pretty face, a brilliant mind wrapped in silk and incense. The nose, just the icing on the lotus cake. The sound of rushing water reaches your ears. Low, steady, rhythmic. You're standing now at the edge of Cleopatra's private bath chamber, where perfumed steam coils lazily above polished marble. Attendants glide across the floor like whispers, their hands full of oils and rose petals. The queen herself is not in sight yet, but everything here is so meticulously arranged. You can feel her presence in the cushions, in the incense, in the silence itself. Tonight we're diving quite literally into Cleopatra's beauty routines, but not to fetishize or glamorize. No, you're here to understand how this queen used the rituals of self-care not just for relaxation, but for diplomacy, identity, and control. Because let's be clear, Cleopatra didn't get ready the way the average noblewoman did. Her regimen was not about attracting male attention. It was about signaling power. You're about to witness a morning routine that makes modern skincare influencers look like amateurs with cucumbers. First off, crocodile dung. Yep, that's your opener. Ancient Egyptian texts mention its use as part of face masks and even, brace yourself, as a contraceptive when mixed with fermented dough. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra herself actually used this concoction or whether later writers just couldn't resist the absurdity. But even if she didn't dab it under her eyes, she would have known about it. And in a world where sacred animals like crocodiles symbolized strength and divine protection, the idea doesn't seem quite as ridiculous as it sounds at first. You pass a copper basin where frankincense and myrrh are being gently crushed into a paste, one of Cleopatra's signature body scrubs. These weren't just fragrant, they were antiseptic, mood-lifting, and in some cases mildly psychoactive. In a time without pharmacies, this was the closest thing to both spa day and medicine. Her favorite oils, almond, castor, olive, each infused with rose, lotus, or cinnamon. She likely anointed herself after every bath, not just to smell heavenly, but to mark her body with layers of symbolic meaning. The scent of blue lotus alone, now nearly extinct in the wild, was associated with both resurrection and erotic awakening. You inhale deeply, it's sweet, heady, and almost intoxicating. Next, the eyeliner. This wasn't just for the cat eye look that modern pop stars still copy, it was protective. Egyptian kohl contained lead-based compounds that actually reduced eye infections. So while Romans laughed at Cleopatra's bold makeup, she was probably the only one in the room without conjunctivitis. She applied it with a tiny ivory stick, tracing long arcs that framed her gaze like temple doors. Each morning, that mirror ritual became both a transformation and a reminder. I am not just a woman, I am a living symbol. In one rare detail from a Roman traveler's account, it said she had a servant whose entire job was to polish a single silver mirror, so perfect that it reflected her image more clearly than still water. It's unconfirmed, of course, but you'd believe it. But there's something deeper to all this. Cleopatra's use of fragrance, color, and texture wasn't shallow, it was political theater. Ancient Egypt believed strongly in Ma'at, the divine balance of beauty, order, and truth. By presenting herself in divine perfection, Cleopatra wasn't just being extra, she was asserting stability in a chaotic world. Historians still debate whether her famed milk baths were real or legend. The story goes she soaked in tubs of fermented donkey milk to keep her skin soft and pale. And yes, lactic acid is a natural exfoliant, modern dermatologists grudgingly agree. But imagine the logistics, hundreds of donkeys, daily milking, that smell in the sun. If it was true, it was dedication on a level few beauty influencers today would dare attempt. You wander now into her wardrobe chamber. Long wooden shelves are stacked with linen robes dyed in muted saffron and indigo, stitched with gold thread. Sandals carved from papyrus rest beside velvet slippers. Each outfit was curated for a purpose: religious festivals, Roman banquets, state councils, and always, her jewelry: thick cuffs, turquoise amulets, rings shaped like serpents. Here's a detail Pliny the Elder couldn't resist repeating: Cleopatra once dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar to win a bet that she could serve the most expensive meal in history. Did the vinegar truly melt the pearl? Scientists think it's chemically possible, if the pearl was small and the vinegar strong, but did it really happen? No one knows. What we do know is that Cleopatra understood drama, and sometimes, power looks like dissolving a fortune into your wineglass just to make a point. You sit now beside her vanity. There's no clutter, just ritual objects, a polished mirror, alabaster jars, finely combed wigs. The room is warm and quiet, except for the trickle of water and the faint clink of gold bracelets. It occurs to you that Cleopatra's greatest tool wasn't any one potion or pearl, it was her ability to turn even the act of getting dressed into a form of power. Her routine wasn't vanity, it was sovereignty. And as the sun rises gently over Alexandria, golden light spilling across the walls, you realize something simple and astonishing. Cleopatra didn't become unforgettable, despite being a woman in a man's world. She became unforgettable because she made that world reshape itself around her. You step onto the cool, shaded tiles of the palace library, though calling it a library is like calling the sun a mild flashlight. This is the House of Life, the legendary heart of Alexandria's knowledge, where scrolls stretched from floor to ceiling and whispered secrets from every known corner of the ancient world. Cleopatra spent countless hours here, and tonight you're invited to join her, not to study, but to strategize. Because for Cleopatra, books weren't just books, they were weapons. Scrolls rustle faintly as you pass. There's one on herbal anesthesia from India, another on Babylonian star charts, A third, it details the regulations of Phoenician trade routes. Most queens might skim for gossip. Cleopatra memorized naval tactics. This isn't a Netflix binge, it's mental weight training. Let's talk about one of her most underrated traits, her obsession with logistics. Most people think of Cleopatra as a romantic figure, drifting on golden barges or lounging in rose-scented baths. But you're watching her pore over ship inventories, negotiate grain taxes, and adjust the exact weight of coinage to offset inflation during a famine. Historians still argue whether she was more economist than queen. And don't forget, she inherited a mess. By the time Cleopatra took the throne at 18, Egypt was in debt, divided, and diplomatically isolated. Her own family line, the Ptolemies, were a hot mess of intermarriage, poisonings and backstabbing. Imagine being the youngest manager at a company where every previous CEO was your cousin, and also tried to kill you. So how did she respond? She became a policy ninja. First, she stabilized the currency. Then, she negotiated with Arabian merchants to secure spice routes. Then, she played Rome and Parthia against each other, while ensuring Egypt stayed just useful enough to both. She revived religious festivals to unify the people. She cut taxes for farmers to boost crop yields. She restructured the grain trade to make Alexandria a mandatory port stop. Every ship, every cargo manifest, had to pass through her city. She wasn't just Queen of Egypt, she was Queen of Infrastructure. Picture her now, seated at a cedarwood desk, stylus in hand, discussing naval imports with her finance minister, while dictating letters in Greek, Egyptian, and maybe even Hebrew. She's got a parrot somewhere that only speaks Latin. You can't keep up, and you have a degree in business. There's a popular tale, half legend, half footnote, about Cleopatra disguising herself as a servant to eavesdrop on her advisors when they thought she wasn't listening. One version says she did it out of distrust, another says she just liked testing them. Either way, it tells you something. This was not a ruler who left anything to chance. Even her famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, strategic. Let's be honest, Cleopatra didn't fall for powerful men, she recruited them. When she first met Caesar, she was in exile, her brother had stolen the throne, and her country was one bad harvest away from revolt. So she allegedly had herself smuggled into Caesar's chambers rolled up in a rug. Historians still debate the accuracy of that image. Some suggest it was more likely a laundry sack. Either way, it worked. She secured her position, restored her rule, and had a son, Caesarion, who instantly became a living symbol of her alliance with Rome. 10 years later, she meets Mark Antony, and while Hollywood tells us it was all hedonism and moonlight kisses, the truth was far more interesting. Antony needed money and ships. Cleopatra needed a Roman power broker, so she invited him to a banquet so lavish, so over the top, that the walls glowed, silver floors, gold dinnerware, incense burning from solid jade bowls, the entire palace transformed into a living poem to seduction and supremacy. This wasn't dating, this was geopolitical theater. Even when she bore Antony's children, she made sure their names echoed conquest. Alexander Helios, son Cleopatra Selene Moon, Ptolemy Philadelphus brother lover, which, okay, maybe not her best PR move, but very on brand. You look up now as a scribe, gently hands Cleopatra a map of the Red Sea coast. She studies it with quiet intensity, then points to a small port where she wants a new lighthouse constructed. She doesn't explain, she doesn't need to. You're beginning to understand, this was not a ruler who reacted to the world, this was a ruler who shaped it. No surprise then, that she wasn't well liked by other rulers. Powerful women rarely are. They called her devious, dangerous, too clever by half, which, if you're Cleopatra, sounds a lot like success. You step outside into the Alexandria twilight, the city buzzes around you, merchants shouting, ships creaking, spices swirling in the air, and above it all, a single tower glows, the lighthouse of Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders, built to guide travelers home. Cleopatra didn't build it, but she ruled by its light, a queen who read the stars, read her enemies, and maybe more importantly, read every scroll she could get her hands on. A dry breeze brushes against your cheek as you follow the sound of distant horns. You're standing now on the balcony of the royal palace, gazing down at Alexandria's grand harbour, one of the busiest in the ancient world. But tonight's not about ships or scrolls, it's about something far more fragile and volatile. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar. You probably already know the broad strokes. Powerful Roman general, ambitious Egyptian queen, political alliance, scandalous romance. But here's the thing, you've never really seen it like this. Not from inside the moment. Not with your bare feet against the cool tiles and your ears full of rumors whispered behind silk fans. And no, it didn't start with a rose-petal-filled bath or a moonlit serenade. It started with a crisis. Cleopatra was 21, exiled, and in the middle of a civil war with her little brother husband Ptolemy the Julius Caesar, already infamous in Rome, arrives in Alexandria chasing his rival Pompey. What does Cleopatra do? She rolls herself up in a carpet and gets delivered to Caesar's quarters like Amazon Prime for political chaos. Was it dramatic? Yes. Was it effective? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether that scene really played out as described by Plutarch, but whether it was a woven rug or a laundry sack, the message was clear. Cleopatra was unafraid of bold entrances, and even more than that, she knew Caesar respected audacity. From the moment they met, it was never about attraction, it was about recognition. Two powerhouses, both strategic thinkers, both wildly ambitious, both tired of being underestimated by their respective political snakes. She didn't seduce Caesar with perfume and poetry, she seduced him with plans. Picture this, the two of them walking through the palace gardens late at night, not holding hands but discussing urban reforms. Cleopatra mapping out trade networks in the dirt with a stick while Caesar calculates legions and supply lines in his head. This wasn't date night, it was a merger. Soon after, Caesar sides with her in the civil war. Alexandria erupts in violence. Ptolemy's forces lay siege to the palace. Cleopatra is trapped inside with Caesar, fighting off arrows and fires while Rome debates whether it even wants him back. At one point, the great library of Alexandria burns. Scholars still debate how much was lost. Thousands of scrolls, tens of thousands. Cleopatra survives the chaos. Ptolemy drowns in the Nile, and the queen emerges victorious. She's reinstated as ruler of Egypt with Caesar's backing, and just like that, the girl who was smuggled into the palace becomes one of the most powerful monarchs on earth. A year later she gives birth to Caesar's only known biological son, Caesarion. Now, here's where it gets even juicier. Caesar never publicly acknowledges the boy. He gives Cleopatra land and status and visits her in Egypt. But in Rome the situation is tense. Romans don't like queens. They really don't like foreign queens. And they absolutely don't like foreign queens who claim their dictator has fathered a child. But Cleopatra doesn't back down. She sails to Rome with her son no less, and lives in Caesar's villa just outside the city. Romans are scandalized. Senators are furious. The tabloids okay. Gossip walls explode. One Roman noblewoman allegedly hissed, "She walks like a goddess and smells like treason." Meanwhile, Cleopatra keeps wearing her crown, her Egyptian garb, and greeting people in Greek. She refuses to Romanize herself, and in doing so she makes an unspoken declaration: "I am not here to blend in, I am here to be noticed." But even Cleopatra couldn't plan what happened next. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar is assassinated on the Senate floor. Cleopatra, likely still in Rome or just having returned to Egypt, finds herself widowed, not legally, but politically. Her greatest ally is gone. Her son Caesarion is suddenly both a link to Rome and a liability. Did she cry? Maybe, but more likely she recalculated. She returns to Egypt, steps back into her throne and prepares for the next storm. Because Cleopatra didn't mourn for long, she pivoted, and that's what makes her partnership with Caesar so extraordinary. It wasn't a love story, it was a power story, one of mutual benefit, shared ambition, and temporary alignment. They weren't Romeo and Juliet, they were Machiavelli's dream couple. Now you're sitting beside a still fountain in the palace courtyard. You can almost hear their conversations echoing in the stone, the low hum of strategy disguised as flirtation. The air smells faintly of cinnamon and war. It's worth noting Cleopatra never remarried, not formally. Her entire adult life, she only publicly aligned herself with two men, Caesar and later, Antony, not because she lacked options, but because she understood that in her world, love was a luxury. Alliance was everything, and perhaps the most fascinating twist of all, she believed Caesarion would one day rule both Egypt and Rome. That vision, ambitious, daring, almost delusional, would shape the next decade of her life, and it would ultimately lead to both her greatest triumphs and her downfall. But we're not there yet. For now, You're watching a young queen navigate the brutal waters of Roman politics with the grace of a swan and the teeth of a crocodile. She doesn't flinch, she doesn't beg, she simply endures. You wake to the scent of seawater and sandalwood. Somewhere in the palace, the curtains are rustling, tugged gently by the warm Nile breeze. Cleopatra is up before dawn again, but not for scrolls or speeches. No, today she's focused on something far more delicate, shaping the image of a goddess. Because here's the wild part of Cleopatra's story that most textbooks skip. This queen didn't just act divine, she was divine. At least, according to her. Let's set the scene. You're in the Temple of Isis in Alexandria, barefoot on cool black stone, incense coils lazily in the air. Priests in white robes chant low hymns. Statues of goddesses tower above, their eyes painted wide open, watching always, and at the center of it all, Cleopatra, high priestess of Isis. Most rulers in her bloodline played around with divine status. The Ptolemies had long claimed to be semi-divine descendants of Alexander the Great, but Cleopatra, she went further. She fully embraced the role of Isis made flesh, the mother goddess of healing, fertility and protection. And to the Egyptian people, this wasn't PR fluff, this was real. She wore the robes of Isis in public ceremonies. She performed ancient rites in fluent Egyptian, something no Ptolemaic ruler had done in generations. She restored temples that had fallen into ruin, endearing herself to a priesthood that had long felt ignored by the Greek-speaking elite. Historians still debate whether she truly believed in her own divinity, or whether it was all a power move. But maybe that's the wrong question. In ancient Egypt, divinity wasn't about faith, it was about function. A pharaoh had to be divine. Without that, the entire machinery of state, rituals, calendars, seasons, the flooding of the Nile, fell apart. So Cleopatra didn't invent the goddess-queen role, she revived it. But here's the clever twist. She wore multiple faces depending on the audience. To Egyptians, she was Isis. To the Greeks in her court, she was the philosophical heir to Plato and Aristotle, an enlightened monarch. To the Romans, she was, well, that depends on the Roman. To Caesar, she was regal, exotic, intellectually equal. To his enemies, she was a dangerous enchantress. To poets and gossip mongers, she was the woman who brought down a republic. But Cleopatra never blinked. She moved between these identities like an actor on a rotating stage, adjusting her costume, but never her core. Even her coins told a story. On Alexandrian currency, she appeared with a hooked nose and sharp jaw. No idealized beauty here, but a face of strength. No queen before her had placed herself so boldly on currency, side by side with her male co-ruler, her brother at first, then Caesarion. Her image wasn't just about vanity, it was branding. You take a seat beside a low marble table, on it lies one of those coins. You run your thumb across Cleopatra's profile. It's not soft, it's not sweet, it's not seductive, it's commanding. That's no accident, because in a world where women in power were constantly sexualized, trivialized, or demonized, Cleopatra made a radical decision. She designed her own mythology. She was a goddess, yes, but also a scholar, a queen, a diplomat, a war commander, a mother, a lover, a symbol, a storm in linen and gold. And when she performed rituals at the Temple of Isis, standing under torchlight, surrounded by chants and lotus petals, she wasn't pretending. She was proving something, that she could hold the sacred and the strategic in the same palm, that she could balance worship and warfare like incense on a scale. Let's take a moment to consider how rare that is. Even today, most women in power are forced to choose a lane, smart or beautiful, strong or nurturing, respected or liked. Cleopatra chose none of those binaries. She was all of it, wrapped in linen, inked in myth, drifting through candlelit halls with a leopard at her side, and a dagger in her belt. There's a scroll tucked away in the back of the temple archive, rare, weathered, mostly forgotten. It describes a festival held in her honor. Thousands gathered, perfume filled the streets, dancers wore silver wings, but the line that catches your eye is this: she stepped through the crowd not as one among us, but as the light that passes between us. Whether it's metaphor or memory, it captures the point. Cleopatra didn't just rule Egypt, she haunted it. Even centuries later, when her name became tangled with gossip, poetry, and propaganda, the truth shimmered beneath. Not a seductress, not a footnote, but a woman who built herself into a symbol powerful enough to outlive the empire that tried to erase her. You walk slowly now, past the temple columns, and out into the sunlight. You can still hear the echo of drums behind you. You wonder if anyone ever really saw the full picture, the real Cleopatra, the one who breathed incense, whispered orders, danced barefoot on the Nile mud, and made entire nations bow by the sheer force of her presence. She didn't wait for historians to write her legacy, she wrote it in stone. You're standing on the deck of a lavish barge now, drifting lazily down the Nile. The sun glints off golden ornaments and polished cedar railings, and the faint sound of flutes dances across the water. This isn't your average river cruise. This is Cleopatra's floating court, complete with musicians, perfumed sails, and attendants in matching linen tunics. And no, this isn't a day trip for tourists. This is a power play in full theatrical bloom. Welcome to Cleopatra's most outrageous diplomatic tour, the royal barge spectacle she used not once but multiple times, to dazzle visiting dignitaries and remind everyone just who ran the show in Egypt. You lean over the side, watching fish ripple just beneath the surface. Behind you, Cleopatra lounges on a high-backed throne shaped like a lotus blossom. She's dressed not in subtle state robes but in full theatrical regalia, plumed headdress, gold cuffs, kohl-lined eyes that rival any modern makeup tutorial. This woman doesn't dress up for politics. She performs it, and no barge ride in history ever matched the one she orchestrated for her next big Roman audience. Mark Antony. You've probably heard of him, the swaggering general, loyal ally of Caesar, Roman war hero with a penchant for wine and wild parties. What you may not know is that Cleopatra flipped his world upside down before they even exchanged pleasantries. Picture this: Antony arrives in the Egyptian city of Tarsus expecting negotiations. Instead, he hears a murmur, then music, then cheers, then her. Cleopatra arrives by river, her barge decked out like a floating temple. Silver oars move in perfect rhythm, perfumed sails fill the air with frankincense and rose. She's dressed as Aphrodite herself, reclining beneath a gold canopy, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids. Was it subtle? Not even remotely. But it worked. Historians still argue whether Antony was truly swept off his feet, or if he was simply smart enough to recognize Cleopatra as a political equal. But either way, the result was clear. The queen had pulled off another headline entrance. This wasn't seduction. This was branding, full sensory spectacle designed to overwhelm, disarm, and dominate. And once again she succeeded. The two of them, Cleopatra and Antony, formed a political and personal bond that would reshape the Mediterranean. But before we get there, let's take a moment to appreciate how good Cleopatra was at showing power without ever raising a weapon. This was a time when kings proved dominance with armies and bloodshed. Cleopatra did it with velvet, ritual, and scent. Her barge wasn't a toy. It was a floating throne, an extension of her identity, and it terrified people. The Roman poet Horace described her as the mad queen with a fleet of perfume. He meant it as an insult, but Cleopatra would have smiled, because that's exactly the point. Even her enemies couldn't look away. You walk to the front of the barge where the river opens wide. Townsfolk gather along the shore just to catch a glimpse of her procession. Children cheer, priests bow, and elders whisper blessings. Cleopatra waves, not like a politician, but like a sun god bestowing light. Somewhere behind the glitter, you notice the detail most miss: armed guards. Beneath all the show, Cleopatra never forgot the stakes. Assassins were common, poisoning, betrayal, cause. She smiled in silk, but she moved like someone who always had an exit strategy, and it worked. This floating theater gave her control. When foreign dignitaries stepped aboard, they entered her world, her reality. Even powerful Romans found themselves entranced and destabilized. You hear a whisper from a nearby servant. Apparently Cleopatra once held court on the barge for 12 hours straight, discussing trade routes while being fanned with ostrich feathers, and served chilled pomegranate wine. Legend? Maybe. But if anyone could do it, it was her. And here's a quirky little fringe fact for your sleepy brain. Cleopatra may have had a personal perfume blend made from blue lotus, myrrh, cinnamon, and cardamom. Archaeologists recently found what could be the remnants of her scent, recreated in a lab and described as hypnotic and spicy. Now imagine that perfume drifting across the river, carried on the wind, hitting Antony before he even saw her face. That's Cleopatra's diplomacy, part scent, part myth, all intention. Her barge wasn't the only floating court she ran. She used it to tour cities, inspect agricultural regions, and host philosophers, poets, and scientists. Imagine Socratic debates beside fish ponds or astrological charts being drawn on silk maps under moonlight. Even her downtime was strategic. You sit again, this time on plush cushions laid out beneath a canopy of indigo silk. The night has fallen, and the Nile glows with torchlight reflections. It's almost too perfect. Too unreal. But for Cleopatra, this wasn't fantasy. This was office space, and it worked. When Antony stepped off her barge at the end of that legendary visit, he wasn't just charmed, he was claimed. Their bond would grow into a saga that would shake empires. But for tonight, just remember this. Cleopatra didn't build castles to impress, she built floating myths and invited the world aboard. By now, you've probably picked up on a pattern. Cleopatra doesn't just react to events, she choreographs them. But what happens when she meets someone who choreographs back? Enter Mark Antony. Round 2. You're in a grand dining hall. Now golden torchlight flickers against stone walls, and the smell of roasted lamb, honeyed dates, and sharp goat cheese wafts through the air. Low music hums in the background. Somewhere to your left, someone is laughing too loudly, possibly drunk. But all eyes are on the main table, where two of the most powerful people in the world are pretending to not flirt. This is no fairy tale. This is politics with wine glasses. Cleopatra and Mark Antony's romance is legendary, sure, but it wasn't all scented boat rides and bedroom whispers. Their alliance was deeply strategic, and as always, Cleopatra played a long game. Let's rewind slightly. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman Republic shattered into civil war. On one side, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; on the other, Mark Antony, Caesar's closest general. Cleopatra had to pick a side, and she picked Antony. Why? Because he had power, armies, influence in the East, and most importantly, he needed her. Antony needed Egypt's wealth. He needed grain for his troops, gold for his campaigns, and a powerful ally in the East, who knew how to keep things under control. Cleopatra offered all three, with strings of course. And in return, she got autonomy, protection, a partner she could negotiate with on near equal terms. You're sipping pomegranate wine now, watching them spar. Antony makes a bawdy joke about Greek philosophers. Cleopatra counters with a quote from Homer that somehow also insults his haircut. Laughter erupts. They're playing a game that no one else at the table even understands. This was their magic. Equal intellect, equal charm, equal stakes. Cleopatra didn't shrink next to Antony, she matched him, step for step. Together they formed what one historian calls a Mediterranean power couple with a penchant for drama. Which brings us to tonight's curious little detail. They formed their own drinking club. No, really. It was called the Inimitable Livers, an exclusive society founded by Cleopatra and Antony for elite extravagant feasting. Members dressed in costume, drank rare wines, and competed in elaborate themed banquets. One night they might recreate a Dionysian orgy, minus the actual orgy, the next a military triumph. It was part theatre, part bonding ritual, part Roman frat party. But here's the genius. Behind the absurdity was diplomacy. These events built loyalty, soothed tensions, and made Antony's Roman officers feel like they were part of something new, something exciting. Cleopatra understood morale better than most Roman generals. And don't be fooled, she didn't just sit at these dinners looking pretty, she debated tactics. She negotiated terms, she listened, observed, memorized who said what. After their third goblet of spiced date wine, one strange little anecdote. During one of these banquets, Cleopatra allegedly bet Antony she could throw the most expensive party in history. He laughed. So she crushed a massive pearl, worth a fortune, dissolved it in vinegar, and drank it. Historians still argue whether that pearl stunt actually happened, but even the rumor did its job. Cleopatra controlled the narrative. Every Roman in Alexandria went home buzzing with stories of the Queen of Egypt and her wild, clever games. You glance around the table again. The air is thick with incense and tension. Someone breaks into a song, off-key but enthusiastic. Cleopatra leans over to Antony, whispering something that makes him raise an eyebrow. No one hears the words, but that's the point. She knows how to speak in silence. And Antony, he's leaning closer, laughing now, forgetting just for a moment that he's meant to be conquering lands, not falling in love. But here's the twist. Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing. She gave Antony loyalty, luxury, laughter. But she also gave him a kingdom that worked. While Rome tore itself apart, Egypt was stable, wealthy, and functional. Grain exports flowed, the Nile tax system thrived, the navy expanded. She wasn't distracting Antony, she was partnering with him. Still, not everyone was thrilled. Roman senators back home whispered of a foreign witch, of a queen corrupting their noble general. They saw Cleopatra's independence as a threat, and they weren't entirely wrong. She wasn't a vassal queen, she wasn't playing second fiddle, she was asserting sovereignty. In fact, Cleopatra went a step further. She demanded that Antony publicly recognize her son, Caesarion, as the rightful heir of Julius Caesar, a direct insult to Octavian, who claimed he was Caesar's only successor. Now that's bold and dangerous. But Cleopatra didn't flinch. You finish your drink as the banquet winds down. Somewhere in the shadows, a poet recites verses about Venus and Mars, two divine lovers bound by passion and war. The metaphor is obvious. Cleopatra and Antony weren't just playing house. They were building an empire, one toast, one alliance, one scandal at a time. So yes, they laughed, and drank, and flirted. But beneath the surface of every joke was strategy, beneath every kiss, a contract, and beneath every pearl-dissolving stunt, a queen who knew how to bend the rules of empire, without ever breaking character. As you stand to leave the hall, you realize something strange. You're no longer surprised by her. You're still dazzled, yes, but you expect the brilliance now, because this is Cleopatra. Nothing is ever just a party, it's always a move. You're walking now through the long columned corridor of Cleopatra's palace, the marble cool beneath your bare feet. Outside, Alexandria hums softly in the blue haze of dawn. Inside, a servant passes silently carrying scrolls, a tray of figs, and oddly, a small caged monkey wearing golden bells. You don't ask questions anymore. You're used to the unexpected, and today's no exception because you're about to witness one of Cleopatra's boldest and most disputed political moves, the donations of Alexandria. Now, try not to doze off quite yet. This part sounds like dry diplomacy, but trust me, it's pure ancient drama, served with a side of royal fanfare and just a pinch of international chaos. Here's the scene. It's 34 BCE. Cleopatra and Mark Antony are at the height of their power. Octavian is fuming back in Rome, waiting for them to slip up. So what do? They throw a party. A big one. A grand public ceremony at the gymnasium in Alexandria, attended by thousands with music, banners, speeches, and a very unexpected twist. You step into the massive square now, sunlight flooding over linen awnings and terraced stands filled with cheering crowds. There's a gold-draped stage, trumpets blare, then Cleopatra appears with her children. Yes, all of them, including her son with Julius Caesar, young Caesarion. They're dressed not as Roman nobles, but as divine monarchs. Cleopatra is Isis, shimmering in white and turquoise. Antony is Dionysus, wild-eyed and smiling. But it's the children who steal the show, because Antony announces something that sends political shockwaves across the empire. He's gifting Cleopatra and her children vast swaths of territory, real, actual lands once controlled by Rome or its client states. To Caesarion, he gives Egypt and Cyprus. To Alexander Helios, their son, he grants Armenia and Media. To Cleopatra Selene, their daughter, he gives Crete and Cyrenaica, and to baby Ptolemy Philadelphus, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor, all of it under Cleopatra's guidance, all of it outside Roman approval. And yes, it's as outrageous as it sounds. Imagine the outrage in Rome. Senators practically spit out their olives. The idea that an Egyptian queen, a woman no less, would be handed dominion over Roman territories. Scandalous. Historians still argue whether Antony had the legal right to do this. Technically, he wasn't handing out Roman land. He was organizing eastern territories that had been in flux for decades, but in the eyes of Rome, it looked like betrayal. Octavian, always the PR genius, spun it as proof that Antony had gone native, that he'd abandoned Roman values, become bewitched by Cleopatra, and was building a rival empire in the east. But from here, on the Alexandrian stage, it looks very different. You watch Cleopatra stand tall beside her children, the crowd roaring approval. This isn't a betrayal, it's a coronation. A visual declaration that Egypt is no longer merely surviving Rome's expansion, it's pushing back. And here's the wild thing. For many in the East, it worked. Local rulers saw Cleopatra as a stabilizing force. Trade increased. Grain moved. Temples were restored. Cleopatra may have been ambitious, but she wasn't reckless. Every territory she received had economic or symbolic value. She knew how to rule, not just wear the crown. Now, let's pause for your quirky fringe detail of the evening. Some scholars believe that during this ceremony, Cleopatra may have worn a robe woven with images of the cosmos, a symbolic nod to her control over fate, stars and destiny itself. Fashion and philosophy. What else is new? Despite the shimmering ceremony, despite the crowd's cheers and Antony's passionate declarations, there's a tension under the surface. A faint tremor in the marble, because Cleopatra knows this move will provoke Rome, that Octavian has to respond. And yet, she proceeds. Not recklessly, calculatingly. Why? Because Cleopatra is hedging bets. If Antony wins the looming civil war, their dynasty becomes unstoppable. If he loses, well, she'll deal with that when she has to. You glance at young Caesarion, seated calmly beside his mother. He looks regal, serious, even a little bored. But you know what this moment means. It's Cleopatra's biggest gamble yet. She's declaring her son the legitimate heir of Caesar. Octavian will never forgive that. And neither will Rome. The sun has climbed higher now. The ceremony ends. Musicians play a slow, triumphant tune. Attendants clear petals from the marble floor. Cleopatra walks slowly back to the palace, children in tow, robes trailing behind her like comet dust. You follow, heart heavy with the knowledge that this glorious pageant is also a final crescendo, the high note before the fall. Because while Cleopatra has always played her hand with grace and daring, she's not the only player left at the table. Octavian is waiting. And he's not here for pageantry. Still, you can't help but admire the spectacle. Cleopatra didn't just dream of an empire. She declared it, dressed it in gold, paraded it before the world, and dared the future to stop her. She may have been wrong, but she was never boring. You wake to the soft creak of oars, gliding across still water. A thin mist rises off the Nile, curling around the wooden beams of a royal barge like ghostly ribbon. Somewhere up ahead, the faint cry of a heron cuts through the hush. This is not a victory parade. Not this time. Cleopatra stands at the prow of the barge, silent, eyes fixed on the riverbank where a Roman standard flaps gently in the breeze. Her fingers tighten on the rail. The donations of Alexandria made headlines, but now the price is coming due. Octavian, ever the quiet operator, didn't send a declaration of war, not exactly. He sent propaganda, scandal, accusations. He told the Roman Senate that Mark Antony had betrayed the Republic, that Cleopatra had seduced him, bewitched him, convinced him to give away Roman lands to their illegitimate children, that he had even rewritten his will to leave everything to Cleopatra, and that this will had somehow ended up in Octavian's hands. Curious how that happens. Historians still debate whether the will was genuine or a forgery. Doesn't matter. Octavian made sure the people believed it, and so the final civil war began, not between Antony and Octavian, but between Rome and Cleopatra. Let that sink in. The official declaration was not against Antony alone. Octavian declared war on Cleopatra personally. Why? Because it was easier to vilify a foreign queen than a fellow Roman. Octavian, who would soon become Augustus, needed a clean narrative. Cleopatra made the perfect villain. Exotic, powerful, female, foreign, every Roman fear wrapped in silk and eyeliner. So now you sit beside her in the royal war room, a low-lit chamber crowded with scrolls, maps and exhausted generals. Mark Antony paces back and forth, muttering about troop movements, while Cleopatra leans over a table, studying supply lines. They know what's coming. They've heard the reports. Octavian is gathering ships, soldiers, support, and worst of all, he's unifying Roman opinion. What Antony lost in PR, Cleopatra tried to counter with alliances, but the East is shaky now. Promises grow thin when legions start marching. Still, they don't panic. Cleopatra has been through worse. Her plan, retreat to Egypt, fortify Alexandria, use the navy, her navy, built meticulously over the past decade, to hold Octavian at bay. Which brings us to the fateful moment, the Battle of Actium. It's 31 BCE. The sky is sharp and cloudless. You're aboard one of the warships, somewhere in the Ionian Sea, salty wind whipping through your robes. Cleopatra's fleet is massive, elegant, but not nimble. Her ships are heavier, designed for dominance, not agility. Octavian's fleet, led by Agrippa, is lean, fast and Roman to the core, and so the battle begins. The sea churns, arrows hiss, firepots crash. Cleopatra's ships try to flank, but Agrippa, anticipates every move. It becomes a slow, chaotic unraveling. Antony fights bravely, but his command chain falters, and then it happens. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, turns her sails to the wind, and retreats. To this day, scholars argue why. Some say it was prearranged, part of a backup plan. Others say it was panic, that she saw the battle was lost and fled to save her fleet. Some even whisper darker theories, that it was betrayal. You stand on the deck, watching as her ship slips away like a ghost, vanishing into the smoke. Antony sees it too, and without a word, he follows. The battle collapses. Octavian doesn't cheer, he calculates. He's won the war without a final blow. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra regroups. The barge returns, battered but intact. The city holds its breath. She hasn't given up, not yet. You join her again in the palace, where she works day and night to shore up defenses, send diplomatic feelers to other Eastern leaders, and even quietly test Octavian's openness to negotiation. One strange detail: she allegedly tested poisons on prisoners in this time, not out of cruelty, but to study how they worked, quickly, painlessly or not at all. She was preparing for every outcome, even the darkest ones. And as you sit beside her in the cool quiet of the palace garden, the scent of lotus and lemon trees hanging in the air, you realize that Cleopatra isn't panicking, she's calculating. Again, she writes to Octavian, offers tribute, asks to let her sons rule in peace. Octavian refuses. She sends another message, this time, suggesting she might even exile herself, perhaps to Thebes or Nubia, if it means sparing Egypt from invasion. Still, silence. Octavian is on his way. The legions are approaching. You feel it in the wind now. A sharpness, an edge. The Nile flows more quickly, as if sensing that time is running short. In these final months, Cleopatra doesn't hide. She dons her royal robes, appears at temples, pays workers, keeps the grain ships moving. If this is the end, she refuses to meet it in shame. You, on the other hand, are desperately hoping she pulls off one more miracle. After all, hasn't she always? You're back in the palace now, but everything feels different. The marble corridors, once filled with echoes of laughter, music, and clinking goblets, have gone quiet. Even the ever-curious monkeys you once spotted in the courtyard seem to have vanished. Alexandria, the jewel of the Nile, is holding its breath. You walk beside Cleopatra through her private library, a room scented with old papyrus and cedar oil, lined with scrolls on astronomy, medicine, and poetry. But she's not reading tonight. She's preparing, because Octavian has arrived. Rome is at her gates. Now this isn't a dramatic siege, not yet. Octavian is patient. He sends envoys. He blocks the ports. He waits. Cleopatra responds the way she always has, with dignity, poise, and a touch of flair. She throws a final diplomatic curveball, reaching out to Octavian himself and offering to meet. Historians still argue about this moment. What was said, what was offered, and whether Cleopatra truly believed she could negotiate her way out of the empire's tightening grip. Some sources say she offered her treasures, her ships, even her crown, as long as Egypt would remain free, and her children safe. Others hint at a more personal play, that she attempted to charm Octavian, as she once did Caesar and Antony. If so, it didn't work. Octavian was cut from colder cloth. But here's the oddest, most whispered detail of the whole encounter. Cleopatra supposedly staged a dramatic meeting, where she presented herself not in royal robes, but wrapped in a simple linen shroud, as if preparing for death itself, a gesture of submission, a threat, or just a final silent negotiation tactic. No one agrees. Still, Octavian gave her no clear answer, only time and a city under occupation. Meanwhile, Antony was unraveling. You find him pacing the palace ramparts, unshaven, eyes wild with sleeplessness. He's lost the war. His legions have defected. Octavian's strategy, clever as ever, has turned many of Antony's own allies against him. And now, rumors are spreading. Someone tells Antony that Cleopatra has betrayed him, that she's already negotiated with Octavian, and plans to abandon him. It's a lie, but Antony believes it. In a fit of grief and rage, he attempts to take his own life. You rush through the corridors with servants as word spreads. Antony, bleeding, gasping, asking for Cleopatra. He doesn't die immediately. He lingers, barely conscious, as they carry him to her private mausoleum, where she's taken refuge. And yes, you heard that right, mausoleum. Cleopatra, always planning several moves ahead, had constructed her own tomb and retreat chamber, stocked with treasures, books, even a throne. Some say it was both sanctuary and stage, a place to make her final stand, or her final statement. They bring Antony to her, and there, in that dim incense-sweet room, he dies in her arms, the man who helped her dream of an Eastern empire, the man who raised her children, gave her command of Roman fleets, and named her Queen of Kings, gone, and now, she is alone. The silence that follows is heavier than anything you've felt yet, not the silence of diplomacy or tension, but the kind that comes after a storm has wrecked everything in its path. You sit with Cleopatra in her mausoleum, as she considers her final move. Egypt has no more cards to play. Octavian enters the city in full Roman splendor, helmet gleaming, laurel crown poised perfectly, and Cleopatra, she prepares for death, but not just any death, her death, on her terms. She dresses herself in royal silks, applies her makeup slowly, carefully, eyeliner sharp, lipstick precise. Even now, especially now, Cleopatra insists on control. There are several theories about how she dies. The most famous involves the asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, supposedly smuggled inside a fig basket. Cleopatra, they say, let the serpent bite her on the arm or breast, and slipped away quietly, elegantly, like a sleeping goddess returning to the Nile. But scholars debate this endlessly. Some argue it was a cocktail of poisons she'd studied months earlier. Others suggest it was a dagger, a hairpin, or even poison hidden in a hair comb. Historians still argue whether the snake story was real, or Roman propaganda, crafted for poetic effect, dramatic flair, and moralizing sermons. After all, what sounds more mythical than a queen dying by the bite of a sacred serpent? You'll never know for sure. All you know is that when Octavian arrives, Cleopatra is gone. Her handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, are dead beside her. The mausoleum is heavy with incense and sorrow. Octavian is furious. He wanted her alive, for a Roman triumph, to parade through the streets of Rome in chains. But Cleopatra denied him even that, because in the end, Cleopatra didn't just rule Egypt, she was Egypt, and like the pharaohs before her, she chose death over humiliation, autonomy over survival. The last of the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh. The door closes softly behind you. A new age begins. Rome will take over Egypt. Caesian, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, will be hunted and killed. Her surviving children with Antony will be taken to Rome, raised in obscurity. Cleopatra's monuments will crumble, her scrolls will scatter, her coins will fade, but her legend, that will live on, not just in marble busts and Shakespeare's pen, but in whispers, dreams, lullabies, in the lingering scent of lotus, drifting across a calm Egyptian river. And you were there, you saw it all. The palace feels abandoned now. You wander its corridors, once alive, with bustling servants, clinking goblets, and the soft purr of pampered cats, now dimmed and quiet. The polished tiles echo beneath your sandals. Outside, Alexandria breathes carefully, still standing but no longer free. Cleopatra is gone. Antony, gone. Egypt as you knew it, is slipping into history. But here's the twist most people forget. Cleopatra's death didn't end her story. In many ways, it began it. You step into the great archives of Alexandria, not the fabled library, long since damaged, but a quieter annex tucked behind the temple district. The scribes here are already copying Cleopatra's legacy onto scrolls for safekeeping. You run your fingers over the dry papyrus, the ink still fresh, lists of trade agreements, tax reforms, temple patronage, astronomical observations. Wait. What? Yes. Cleopatra wasn't just a seductress in eyeliner. She was a scholar, a reformer, and a policy wonk of the highest order. Historians tend to reduce her to love affairs and suicide notes, but the records tell a fuller story. She spoke at least 7 languages, some say as many as 9. She personally oversaw trade expeditions to Nubia and the Arabian Peninsula. She kept Egypt's grain reserves flowing to both her own people and the ever-hungry markets of Rome. And perhaps most surprisingly, she was the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to actually speak Egyptian fluently. Think about that. For 300 years her Greek-descended dynasty had ruled Egypt without bothering to adopt the local tongue. Cleopatra broke that mold. She performed religious rites in native dialects, dressed in traditional pharaonic style during ceremonies, and positioned herself as Isis incarnate, a living goddess, sure, but one fluent in your prayers. So, was Cleopatra Greek or Egyptian? Both, and neither, and something new entirely. In her lifetime, she was viewed as a cosmopolitan chameleon, a woman who could dine with Roman senators and pray beside Nile priests. She made politics theatrical, and theatre political. Even her palace decor, mixed Greek marble with Egyptian lotus columns and Persian silk curtains. A whole style of fusion that wouldn't be popular again for 2,000 years. And now, as you step into her old audience chamber, you notice what remains. Not much. A cracked statue, a faded tapestry, a few surviving coins stamped with her profile, nose slightly hooked, chin proud, eyes large and unblinking. Not quite the Hollywood beauty people imagine, but striking, distinct. Those coins, by the way, are some of the most debated artifacts in Cleopatra scholarship. Some argue she purposely had her likeness engraved with less than ideal features to appear serious, regal, masculine, in a way that emphasized her intellect over appearance. Others suggest it was just poor craftsmanship. Ancient minting wasn't exactly high def. Historians still argue whether those portraits reflect Cleopatra's actual appearance, or whether they were another form of calculated propaganda. Because here's the bigger point. Cleopatra controlled her image long before Instagram made it cool. She understood symbols, knew when to show strength, when to lean into mystery. She could ride a warhorse one day, and the next, arrive on a barge dressed as Aphrodite, drifting down the Nile, under a canopy of perfumed sails. All to send a message: I am in charge of the story. And now you're wondering, how did that story survive? After all, Octavian, now Augustus, had every reason to bury her memory. He demolished her statues, erased her name from temples, and tried to brand her as a cautionary tale. Yet something strange happened. Rome couldn't stop talking about her. She became legend. To the Romans, she was a dangerous foreign queen, who lured good men to ruin. To poets like Virgil and Horace, she was a tragic heroine. To Shakespeare, centuries later, she was the very definition of romantic drama. And in every version, she shimmered differently, sometimes villain, sometimes victim, sometimes goddess. You run your hand along the palace wall, feeling the grooves worn by time and retelling. Somewhere out there, her children are growing up in a new empire. Her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, would go on to rule Mauritania, modern-day Algeria, and Morocco, as a Roman client queen. She married well, built cities, minted her own coins. A quieter legacy, but a legacy nonetheless. And through it all, Cleopatra remained a haunting figure, too brilliant to forget, too complex to flatten, which is probably why her story still draws people in. Even now, in the dead of night, centuries removed, she feels present. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as a human puzzle. A woman who ruled in a man's world, played the game better than most, and refused to fade away quietly. And you were lucky enough to walk beside her, to smell the oils she wore, to hear the timbre of her voice, to watch her rework alliances like a chess grandmaster under siege. You stand at the palace window now, looking out over the dark Nile. Somewhere below, fishermen sing softly, a cat prowls between pillars. The moonlight glints off the domes of Alexandrian temples. The age of pharaohs has ended, Rome has won. But Cleopatra, she's still here, in every whisper of wind, in every curling reed, in every question that begins with what if. What if she'd won the Battle of Actium? What if she'd lived? What if the world had been ruled by Alexandria, not Rome? You'll never know, but tonight you can dream it. You step away from the window, drawn back toward the hush of the corridors, still warm with the fading scent of incense and myrrh. The halls of Cleopatra's palace may be silent, but echoes linger, whispers of strategy meetings, bursts of laughter, a child's footsteps chasing a pet ibis. You turn a corner and find yourself in a different space. A room filled not with scrolls or treasures, but with mirrors. Polished bronze plates hang along the walls, cleverly angled to catch and bounce sunlight deep into the palace. Some are decorated with tiny etchings, lotus blossoms, falcons, the eye of Horus. Others are blank, worn down by years of gazing. This was Cleopatra's vanity chamber. But it wasn't just for makeup. Here you realize something remarkable. Cleopatra understood optics, not just physical reflection, but political reflection. She knew how to project power through sight alone. Her entrances were choreographed, her costumes symbolic, her posture calculated, her voice trained for clarity, softness, and sudden command. And she wasn't just imitating old pharaohs, she was updating their brand. Think about it. Cleopatra lived in a time when image was power, when statues, coins, murals, and rumor did the work of modern media, when spin wasn't a PR term, it was survival, and she spun well. The infamous carpet trick, rolling herself up inside to meet Julius Caesar, isn't just a romantic flourish, it's strategic genius. In one move she disarmed an enemy, turned surprise into advantage, and made herself unforgettable. Historians still argue whether that moment was real or dramatized by later writers, but it hardly matters, because the story stuck. Cleopatra made sure it would. Even her enemies took the bait. Roman propaganda painted her as dangerous, exotic, too smart for comfort, a foreign queen who wielded her femininity like a weapon, which, by the way, says more about Roman anxiety than it does about her. You turn and study your reflection in one of the ancient bronze mirrors. It's distorted, soft around the edges, like trying to remember a face from a dream, and you realize, so much of what we know about Cleopatra is just like this, reflected, refracted, rewritten. Take her so-called extravagance. Yes, she threw decadent banquets. Yes, she supposedly dissolved a pearl in vinegar, just to win a bet. But she also stabilized the Egyptian economy, controlled inflation, and reformed agricultural taxes. Not exactly reckless behavior. One moment she's draped in gold, commanding Roman generals with a flick of her fan. The next she's calculating shipment routes for grain exports and negotiating with Syrian merchants over saffron prices. She was ruler and performer, scholar and seductress, scientist and symbol, and she moved through those roles effortlessly. Never quite who you thought she was, but always exactly who she needed to be. Now you walk into her bath chamber, steamy tiled in sea blue glass, a small fountain gurgling in the corner. The air smells of rosewater and salt. Here Cleopatra would have scrubbed away the day, perhaps while listening to poetry, or dictating letters to Rome, perhaps with her favorite greyhound curled at her feet. Did she ever let herself rest? Did she laugh when no one was listening? Did she ever look into one of those bronze mirrors and see a girl from a broken dynasty pretending to be a goddess, and wonder if the world believed her? You sit beside the bath, letting your fingers trail through the cool water. This moment, more than any, feels real, because behind every empire, every military alliance, every golden throne, was a woman raised to believe she had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast everyone around her. And for nearly 20 years she did. Her reign was the longest of any Ptolemaic ruler. She survived Roman civil wars, revolts, earthquakes, famine, and the endless scheming of both allies and enemies. And when the final curtain fell, she did not flinch. She died as she lived on her own terms, with full awareness of her legacy. So now, as the steam curls around you and the past softens into shadow, you ask yourself, was Cleopatra a tragic figure, or a triumphant one? She lost her kingdom, yes. She lost her love, her life, her family. But she shaped history so forcefully that even now, thousands of years later, we are still trying to define her, that kind of immortality. It's rare. Cleopatra didn't need a pyramid to be remembered. She built her legacy in flesh, ink and myth. And now, it's etched into your memory too, one detail at a time. From the clink of her bracelets, to the sigh of her linen robes, from the rasp of her papyrus letters to the soft echo of her laugh drifting through the courtyards. She is with you now, a queen, a symbol, a shadow, a spark. And as you stand and leave the room behind, the mirrors watch you go, not reflecting your face, but hers, still watching, still waiting, still unforgettable. You step out into the garden courtyard, the night air cooled by the murmur of fountains and the rustle of papyrus leaves. Above you, Alexandria's stars flicker like tiny fires, burning gently, endlessly, as they did over Cleopatra's final nights. This was her refuge. A private oasis tucked between the palace wings, where she walked barefoot across dew-kissed grass, where she fed sacred ibises by hand, and where she may have come quietly alone to think. And oh, did Cleopatra think? Here's something most people miss about her final days. While Octavian closed in, and Antony faltered, Cleopatra didn't panic. She planned. Inside these walls, she wrote letters, sealed parchments with wax, and sent final gifts to allies she knew would betray her anyway. She arranged for the safety, or at least the survival of her children. She counted her treasures, weighed her options, and set the stage for the ultimate performance. Her last act wasn't desperation. It was design. But before we get there, before the famous asp, before the shrouded sarcophagus, let's take a moment to breathe in this garden. Let your toes sink into the same grass she walked. Hear the wind hum across stone benches where she once sat and whispered verse. Smell the blue lotus, her favorite flower, blooming sweet and heavy in the dark. This was Cleopatra's thinking space, her silent war room, her moment of peace. because even the sharpest minds need stillness, and hers was one of the sharpest. Did you know she held debates with philosophers in this courtyard? That she brought mathematicians from Rhodes and alchemists from Cyrene to sit beneath these olive trees and argue about the soul? One scholar described her voice as sweet, almost musical, but with a weight that made even the cockiest Roman diplomat pause before interrupting. That's power. Historians still argue whether she was more politician or philosopher, but here, in her garden, you can imagine she didn't separate the two. And somewhere in the shadows, a lion paces. No, not a metaphor, a real lion. Cleopatra had a menagerie, exotic animals gifted from Nubia, India, and farther still. Peacocks, monkeys, a giraffe that terrified the dockworkers, and yes, a lion cub she raised from infancy. You imagine it now, grown but tame, padding softly between marble columns, while the queen reads aloud from a scroll of Homer or Herodotus. Not exactly the Cleopatra they taught you in school, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? The more you learn, the more she changes. Every time someone tried to pin her down, lover, tyrant, goddess, traitor, she wriggled free, a shapeshifter in a world that hated ambiguity. You take a seat on one of the warm curved benches carved with Greek maxims and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Know thyself, one says. Another reads, speak only when your words can sweeten silence. Here, beneath the fig trees, you try to imagine her final days, her lover dead by his own blade, her ships burned in the harbor, her enemies knocking at the gate, and still she walks these paths with her head held high. Because for Cleopatra, surrender was not just political failure, it was narrative failure. To be paraded through Rome in chains, forced to bow before Octavian on his victory tour, unthinkable. So she controlled the ending. Now, before we get to the popular myth, asp in a fruit basket, dramatic swoon, let's pause. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra really died by snakebite. Some suggest poison hidden in a hairpin. Others think she used a mixture of opium and hemlock. The only constant, she died on her own terms, and maybe even that is a myth. Because what if she didn't die right away? What if the poison didn't work at first? What if for just a few agonizing hours, she lingered, half-conscious, wrapped in silk, listening to the soft bubbling of her garden fountains as her world faded? Not very Hollywood, but very human. And isn't that the real tragedy? Not that she lost her throne or her war, but that for all her genius, she lived in a time that would not let her live beyond the shadow of the men she loved. Even now in most tellings, her name is paired with Antony's, rarely on its own. So let's sit a little longer in this garden, not to mourn, but to remember. The ruler who commanded ships and sciences, the queen who translated Homer into Egyptian, the strategist who outwitted Roman spies, charmed philosophers, and personally organized her own fleet. The woman who made an empire kneel, and then walked away from it, head held high. She is not here anymore, but her scent is on the blossoms, her voice is in the wind, and somewhere just beyond your sight, a lion paces, still waiting for her return. The lion is gone now, vanished into the folds of memory, and you move again deeper into the palace's silent heart, past cool colonnades and shuttered balconies, until you reach a vaulted room lined with heavy wooden chests. This is Cleopatra's treasury, not the state vault that was hidden deep beneath the temple of Punna, guarded by priests and snakes and superstition. No, this was her personal collection, her trove of strange, exquisite, and deeply strategic possessions. And it starts with something deceptively simple. Books, dozens of them, scrolls in Greek, Demotic, Aramaic, and Latin, copied by hand from the Great Library, smuggled in from Athens or scribbled by anonymous scholars along the Tigris. Astrology, alchemy, engineering, theatre, every corner of the known world fit neatly into Cleopatra's private archive. She didn't just read history, she prepared for it. It's easy to forget, lulled by the perfume of myth, that Cleopatra wasn't just reacting to her era, she was studying it, predicting it, and shaping herself to survive it. One scroll catches your eye. It's bound in soft goat leather, its title written in careful red ink, Methods of Naval Smoke Signals. You smile. Cleopatra had smoke signal communication long before Rome even figured out organized road signs. Historians still argue whether she developed it herself or borrowed the idea from the Phoenicians, but the fact remains, she turned her navy into a network. This woman didn't just fight with swords, she fought with information, and that brings us to one of the strangest treasures in the room, a palm-sized box carved from obsidian. Inside, nestled in crushed lapis, is a single bronze needle, tiny, innocent, or so it seems, because Cleopatra's court was rife with espionage. She ran a spy network that stretched from Carthage to the Indus. Traders, dancers, and even physicians doubled as informants. Messages were smuggled in figs, coded in embroidery, and inked invisibly onto skin. This needle, it was likely part of an assassination kit, dipped in venom, slipped into a sleeve, delivered with a handshake, and she knew all of it. It was how she stayed ahead. In fact, there's a theory, quietly floated among a few fringe historians, that Cleopatra may have orchestrated some of the most pivotal betrayals in her own court, just to tighten her grip on power. Too cold-hearted? Maybe. Too smart? Definitely. And here's where things get odd. Among the chests of gold coins, scarab amulets, and Roman jewelry, you find an entire drawer filled with miniature sandals, not for children, not for show, just tiny, some no longer than your thumb. Their soles are made of woven reeds, their straps lined in silk thread. One pair has the initials C+M, sewn into the fabric. Cleopatra and Mark Antony, maybe. Or maybe it's just another mystery in a life full of them. One theory suggests they were used as charms, talismans for fertility, safe travel, or even political good luck. Another suggests Cleopatra had a particular sense of humor, because after all she was funny. That's something the dramatized versions always miss. Her wit. Plutarch wrote that her charm lay not just in her beauty, but in her sweetness, in the tones of her voice and the playfulness in her speech. She could tease a general until he turned red, then pivot to philosophy without missing a beat. You can almost hear her now, teasing one of her court scribes for mixing up a verb tense, or challenging a Roman ambassador to name every known star in the southern sky, then correcting him halfway through. And as you're lost in this imagined laughter, your fingers brush against something tucked in the corner of the treasure chest. A small glass vial. The liquid inside has turned cloudy with age, but you recognize the symbol on the stopper, an owl holding a scale. It's her signature blend. Cleopatra was known for experimenting with perfumes and cosmetics, not just to enhance beauty, but to evoke memory, power, and even fear. This particular fragrance was supposedly mixed with blue lotus, cinnamon bark, honeycomb resin, and just a hint of myrrh aged in cedarwood barrels. She wore it before every negotiation, and it worked, because Cleopatra didn't just command through intellect or lineage, she commanded through presence. The way she entered a room, the scent that trailed behind her, the silence she invited, not through force, but gravity. You hold the vial to your nose. It smells like crushed time and ancient secrets. This is what power really was, in Cleopatra's world. Not brute strength, but subtle mastery. Not domination, but orchestration. Like a conductor, she arranged players, Caesar, Antony, the Roman Senate, the Egyptian priesthood, into a symphony she almost completed. Almost. Because even the sharpest minds can't predict every storm. Even the most careful treasuries can't hold off fate. Still, Cleopatra knew this too. That's why she didn't cling to her treasures. In her final hours, it's said she distributed many of these possessions to trusted servants, scholars, and temple scribes. She wanted her story to survive, not just in gold or gossip, but in objects that could whisper truth when history tried to rewrite her. And so, as you stand in this room, surrounded by shadows of her intellect and glittering oddities of her reign, you feel the quiet hum of a mind that never stopped preparing. Even in death, she was thinking forward. Now, through a heavy, painted doorway, you step into one of the most private spaces in Cleopatra's entire palace, her bath chamber. But this is no ordinary tub and towels setup. This is a shrine to sensory indulgence, half temple, half chemistry lab. You're standing in a room where steam curls from polished bronze pipes, where the walls are covered in hand-painted murals of Nile deities, lounging among lotus blossoms, and where everything smells faintly of almond oil and rose water. It's warm in here, comforting, intimate, and yes, maybe just a little haunted. Cleopatra didn't just bathe for hygiene, she bathed like a strategist, she bathed like a performance artist. And in this room, every bath was a calculated spell. You look down and notice a sunken tub carved directly into the floor, lined with black basalt. According to fringe historians, this tub was infused with magnets to align the humors of the body. Real science? Maybe not. But Cleopatra believed in combining ritual and reason, sacred practice with statecraft. And no, she didn't bathe in milk every day. That was marketing. More likely, she used fermented donkey milk only occasionally, as part of a special skin-softening treatment. Historians still argue whether it worked, or simply smelled like regret. But what she did use regularly, enzyme-rich papaya pastes, crushed pearl exfoliants, and something called blue marl clay, which was hauled in from a river delta near Memphis. Not that Memphis, the original one, in ancient Egypt. She'd slather it on while a court poet read love sonnets. Relaxation, sure, but also ritualized control. Because Cleopatra understood the psychology of cleanliness, she knew that appearing radiant, literally glowing, before a Roman envoy or rival priestess, wasn't just aesthetic, it was tactical. She weaponized softness, she weaponized scent. Imagine the scene: she emerges from this room, skin shimmering with oil, hair coiled into braids, laced with gold thread, and her eyes lined with malachite green. She doesn't speak at first, she just looks, and the room listens. That wasn't magic, that was mastery. Across from the bath sits her cosmetic cabinet, more like a throne-sized altar to self-curation. Dozens of tiny ceramic jars, each labeled in a spidery blend of Greek and Demotic script. Saffron mascara, date pit kohl, frankincense balm for eyelids. You lift a wooden lid and find a mirror, polished obsidian, dark and flawless. It said she never used bronze or silver for her mirrors, too distorted, too heavy. She preferred seeing herself reflected in darkness. You can't help but wonder, what did she see? A goddess, a survivor, a woman with no room for error. Beside the mirror is something strange, an ancient brass tool shaped like a tuning fork. You frown. A beauty device, a musical instrument. Scholars still debate it. Some believe it was a type of skin vibrator, used to increase circulation. Others say it's purely symbolic, a reminder that harmony of body and mind was the real foundation of her power. You run your hand along the wall, and feel a small carved inscription in Greek. Dash-to, alpha, dash-to, alpha, dash-to, alpha, dash-to. A clean body, a clear mind. She lived by that. And this wasn't just about pampering, this was her armor. Even in the final days when Octavian's ships loomed near, when Antony was losing ground, Cleopatra continued her bathing rituals. There are Roman accounts of her taking time each evening to soak, meditate, and apply oils while the world burned outside her palace, not out of vanity, but to remind herself she still held some control. And maybe that's why, of all her rituals, this one feels the most human. Because no matter how grand the throne, how heavy the crown, how sharp the political mind, Cleopatra still needed time to sit in silence, steam rising around her, oils on her skin, breath steady, watching her own reflection blur in the water. And maybe she asked the same things you ask yourself in quiet moments. Am I enough? Will they remember me the way I choose? What happens if I don't win? You imagine her leaning back in the tub, arms draped along its carved edges, fingers tracing lazy spirals through the water. Beyond the marble walls, the city holds its breath. The Romans are coming. But here, she is still queen, still choosing her moment, still deciding the story. There's a poem written by a later Egyptian scribe, anonymous, found buried in a ruined temple, centuries after her death. It ends with this line: "She bathed not for beauty, but so her skin would carry the strength of the Nile." And you believe it. In this chamber, warm and perfumed, you realize Cleopatra's real secret wasn't seduction, or genius, or even charm. It was the relentless sacred discipline of preparation. Her baths weren't breaks from power, they were how she held onto it. You step quietly from the bath chamber, skin prickled slightly from the warmth, as if Cleopatra's ritual had passed through you by osmosis. The corridor darkens again, and ahead, a curtain of woven linen shifts slightly in the breeze, beckoning. You brush it aside, and enter one of the strangest, most sacred rooms of all, Cleopatra's dream chamber. Not her bedroom, not the royal bedchamber, with its carved cedar canopy and linens from Tyre. No, this room was kept separate, hidden behind layers of guards, astrologers and rumors. This was where Cleopatra dreamed, deliberately. You wouldn't be the first to think, wait, what? A room just for dreaming? Yes, because Cleopatra believed dreams weren't random. They were messages, warnings, blueprints, and she didn't leave them to chance. The room is round, domed like a miniature planetarium, and lined with constellations painted in crushed lapis and gold. The floor is cool alabaster, arranged in a spiral mosaic, leading to a central mat of woven reeds. Beside it sits a lamp, its flame flickering behind colored glass panels, casting the walls in a soft indigo glow. This is where she practiced incubation, a ritual from ancient Egyptian priesthood, revived by Cleopatra as both science and sorcery. She would fast lightly, bathe in lotus oil, chant invocations to the goddess Isis, and then sleep here, seeking messages in her dreams. And here's where it gets even stranger. She recorded her dreams. Yes, Cleopatra kept a dream journal, dictated each morning to a trusted scribe named Dionysius. He was sworn to secrecy, and according to one obscure Greek commentary, he used an invented code that only 2 living souls could understand. Historians still argue whether any fragments of that dream journal survived. Some claim a set of cryptic symbols discovered on a temple pillar in Dendera might be linked. Others say it's all myth, another clever story in her long line of calculated mystique. But consider this. A queen with access to oracles, astrologers, and sacred rites still chose to return, night after night, to her own inner world. That says something. It says she didn't just look outward, to the stars or the scrolls, but inward, to the wild theater of her own subconscious, not for comfort, but for intel. And it wasn't just for herself. She used these dreams in governance. There's a recorded moment from her court, when she changed a diplomatic treaty based on a dream about a bird biting through a golden chain. The Roman envoy was furious, but she simply said, "The gods speak in symbols, I choose to listen." There's even a surviving Egyptian papyrus listing certain scents she used to shape her dreams, a mixture of mandrake, honey and fennel to induce visions, a paste of opium and crushed violet for clarity. She would anoint her temples and soles of her feet, believing that sleep should be summoned like an honored guest. You lie down on the mat, just to feel it. The air hums here, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. You realize this is the closest you'll come to Cleopatra's unguarded self, because in war, in love, in court, she performed, she charmed, she calculated. But in this room, in this half-waking drift, she asked the questions no scroll could answer, the future no spy could predict. She let the cosmos speak, and she listened with the same sharp mind she brought to naval strategy or palace economics. She wasn't waiting for fate, she was studying it. You glance again at the walls. The constellations aren't just artistic, they're accurate. A map of the sky, as it looked on the night of her coronation. She had them repainted yearly to reflect any celestial shifts. Talk about a bedroom makeover. And here's something even more bizarre. Cleopatra supposedly believed her soul had visited other eras, that in dreams, she had seen herself living in different ages, different bodies, always as a ruler, always as a woman in charge of vast and unstable empires. You might laugh at that, if it weren't so oddly fitting. Because let's be honest, Cleopatra never felt entirely of her time. She felt like someone ahead of it, reading it, steering it, even dodging it when needed. In this dream chamber, she blurred time, she turned prophecy into policy, and maybe that's what made her dangerous. Not the beauty, not the wit, but the audacity to believe she could see the pattern behind the chaos. You take one last look around. The lamp still flickers, the air still smells faintly of blue lotus and beeswax, and you can't help but feel, this is where the real Cleopatra lived, not on the throne, not in Caesar's arms, not even in death, but here, eyes closed, mind open, body at rest, listening for the whisper of a future only she could hear. The dream chamber fades behind you like a half-remembered thought. And now you're walking deeper into the palace's oldest wing, a section so rarely used, even Cleopatra's own guards weren't always sure what went on here. Stone steps wind downward, air grows cooler, and at the base, you find something that seems entirely out of place in a queen's palace. A private laboratory, not a temple, not a treasury, an actual lab, lined with clay pots, glass beakers, bronze instruments, and shelves heavy with scrolls. This was Cleopatra's personal workshop for experimentation, where she blurred the lines between science, magic, and medicine. Not many know this, but Cleopatra was a chemist, a scholar, a curious mind who didn't simply commission cures. She tried making them. You step inside, and it feels like a blend of Hogwarts and ancient Alexandria. The room hums with the faint smell of vinegar, old ink, and crushed herbs. To your left, a table crowded with mortars and pestles, fragments of pomegranate peels, powdered charcoal, and vials labeled in 3 languages, Greek, Demotic, and something that looks like coded glyphs. To your right, a half-burnt scroll containing a list of oils and acids, Cleopatra, allegedly mixed to create one of the world's first cosmetic exfoliants, a chemical scrub, millennia before Sephora, and front and center, a golden-bound book, simply titled Toxicon. Yes, Toxicon, a word that means both poison and remedy. Cleopatra studied both. You probably know the myth that she poisoned herself with a snake, But what if that wasn't random? She had spent years testing antidotes, observing how poisons affected both body and mind. Pliny the Elder even claimed she once dosed herself with small amounts of deadly substances to test her resistance, a sort of ancient microdosing. Historians still argue whether that's true, or just more Roman dramatization, but the sheer detail in the records hints at real experimentation. She combined opium with wine, mixed hemlock with honey, boiled crushed scorpions into salves. She wasn't guessing, she was researching. It gets weirder. A fringe theory claims Cleopatra invented a slow-acting sleeping draught, safe in small doses, lethal in larger ones, that she used not for murder, but for diplomacy. Why? Because she could appear to resurrect a fainted guest during tense negotiations. Imagine faking death, only to wake up after being kissed by the Queen of Egypt. Talk about performance art. Another scroll details a salve she was perfecting, a balm made of aloe, myrrh, and electro-charged gold dust, supposedly used to draw out sadness from the chest. Sound like placebo? Sure, but we're talking about a woman who understood the power of belief. In this lab, Cleopatra's power wasn't theatrical, it was tactile. No speeches, no seductions, just formulas, observations, tiny explosions, and the slow alchemy of trying to turn pain into peace, or death into a tool. One table contains a strange machine, 2 copper rods, a basin, and what looks like a crank. According to one theory, it's a primitive electrotherapy device, meant to stimulate nerves or possibly restore movement to injured limbs. A Roman source mentions her using electric fish to treat headaches. Maybe this was her mechanical version, less flopping eel, more clean technology. And again, you ask yourself, was this madness, or was this someone who simply refused to wait for history to catch up? You can practically see her here, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp, scribbling in a notebook as something hisses on a hot plate nearby. Not a queen, not in that moment, but a woman obsessed with solving things, illness, pain, power, even, maybe, mortality. You find one final scroll, its title nearly rubbed off. The only word still clear is asphodel, a flower linked to the underworld, to sleep, to rebirth. The recipe is fragmented, but some words survive: honey, ground pearl, nightshade, sandalwood, silence. Yes, silence. As if Cleopatra believed that peace of mind could be compounded like a drug, bottled, measured, applied. You step back from the table and realize something. While the world called her enchanting, she was experimenting. While Rome called her dangerous, she was documenting. While lovers and enemies circled like vultures, Cleopatra retreated here, not to hide, but to build. She wasn't just Egypt's last queen, she might have been its first laboratory mystic. And as you leave the lab behind, the torches flickering low, you understand this woman didn't fear death. She studied it, prepared for it, and maybe beat it in her own strange way. Because the real Cleopatra lives on in the formulas, the half-burnt notes, the stories you've heard tonight, refusing to dissolve, refusing to be solved. You step out of the lab and back into the night air. For the first time in hours, the sky above Alexandria reveals itself, quiet, vast, stitched with stars. A few scatter over the dark sea, like grains of light spilled from a broken amphora, and you're standing on the palace's highest balcony now. Not a grand throne room, not a hall of mirrors, just stone beneath your feet, and a view Cleopatra once stood to admire. You try to picture her here, in the quiet hours between chaos. A queen, a widow, a mother of 4, a strategist playing chess with the future, while everyone else argued over maps and ships and treaties. The final chapter of her life looms large in popular imagination. Cleopatra's death wrapped in mystery, drama, and enough bad Hollywood accents to fill a Colosseum. But let's peel that curtain gently. We know this much. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, had seized Alexandria. Her forces were scattered. Antony, her last great love and ally, was dead by his own hand. The palace was no longer a sanctuary but a cage. And yet, Cleopatra did not go quietly. She staged her final moments like a play, every detail orchestrated. She dressed in royal robes. She had her attendants prepare the room. Some say she arranged fresh flowers. Others say she burned incense, so the air would be filled with the scent of blue myrrh, a fragrance she had always loved. And then came the question that has baffled scholars for centuries. How did Cleopatra die? The asp, that famous serpent in a basket of figs. It's poetic, it's haunting, and honestly, a little logistically questionable. Asp venom doesn't kill quickly or painlessly, especially if applied in such a theatrical way. Some historians argue she used a poison-laced hairpin, or that she drank a slow, paralyzing draught she had concocted herself. Others think Octavian had her quietly executed, and the suicide story was just a convenient tale he let circulate to make himself look merciful. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra chose her ending or had it chosen for her, whether she scripted her exit as a final act of defiance, or simply couldn't bear to live in a world ruled by Rome. But maybe the truth is simpler. She wanted control over her life, over her legend, over the narrative, and in that she succeeded. Because here you are, over 2,000 years later, standing in the ghost of her palace, trying to picture her last breath, and you can't quite find it. That's the thing about Cleopatra. She slips through the cracks of certainty. One moment she's a seductress, the next a scholar, a queen, a chemist, a general, a dreamer. She refused to be just one thing, and maybe that's why history still wrestles with her. She didn't fit the molds that men carved out for women in power. She shattered them, then melted the shards into something of her own design. Even in death she left us wondering, and that is a kind of immortality. You linger here a moment longer, listening to the wind, to the hush of time, and if you close your eyes you can almost hear her, somewhere between the surf and the stars, laughing softly, as if to say, "You thought this story had an ending, darling. I've only just begun."